Hello again. This is Craig Smith, your host for Beatle Basics, a YouTube channel and associated podcast focused on the Beatles. Today's episode is on George Martin, the Beatles producer at EMI Studios. Before we jump into this, though, I think it's important to point out that George Martin was only one of several individuals who made the Beatles the phenomenon that they would eventually become. For example, their manager, Brian Epstein, who played obviously a critical role in their success. Their roadies, Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall. They had a couple publicists over the years, beginning with Tony Barrow and then Derek Taylor. Dick James was their music publisher, and there were, of course, many engineers and other technicians at EMI Studios, such as Norman Smith and Jeff Emmerich. But George Martin, he, of course, played a critical role in the success and life of the Beatles. I want to tell you today about how he came to work at EMI, and then his introduction to and lengthy career overseeing the Beatles' work, and then talk a little bit about what he did after the Beatles. It's important to note that George Martin came to EMI Studios and his association with the Beatles with a musical background. He attended the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, where he studied musical composition. He was also an accomplished oboe player as well as a classical pianist. This would come in very handy later on when he worked with the Beatles in much more than just a technical or producer capacity, where he was actually helping them arrange and write their music. But it was just by chance that he heard of an opening at EMI Studios in St. John's Wood, London. And the job was to be the assistant to Oscar Pruis. Mr. Pruis was the head of one of the labels under the EMI umbrella, Parlophone. At that time, EMI consisted of, in addition to Parlophone, HMV, Columbia Records, Regal Zonophone, and then in January of 1955, EMI purchased Capitol Records. Well, Mr. Pruis retired as the head of Parlophone on April 4th of 1955, and young George Martin was offered the job. At the time, Parlophone was known for the rather offbeat, somewhat odd acts that they produced. They had various instrumentalists. They had a polka band. So this was the label within EMI that got the sort of weird acts. They also did a lot of comedy. Peter Sellers was one of their main personalities. If you're my age, you would know who Peter Sellers is. He was also part of a group called the Goons, in addition to his solo career that he was involved in later on. The Beatles were big fans of the Goons, and all of these things sort of came together to form this very successful relationship between the four of them and George Martin. Well, one of the first things that George knew he needed to do was to somehow re-energize this label. He recognized that rock and roll music was going to pretty much change the recording and music industry, and he wanted Parlophone to be a part of it. Real success, as you can imagine, for George Martin began when he was introduced to a man by the name of Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. I think it's important to note that Brian had played his demo tape of the Beatles for several others at EMI, and they all rejected it. They just didn't think that it was that good. But eventually, Brian was referred to George Martin by a man by the name of Sid Coleman, who was actually in music publishing. And Brian played the tape for him, and like all the others, George Martin was less than impressed. But pretty much just out of sympathy, just because he knew how hard Brian Epstein had been working to peddle this recording, these demo tapes around London, George Martin agreed to give the Beatles an hour in the studio. That very important day in music history was June 6th, 1962, when the Beatles first went into EMI studios. They played 4 songs that day: Besame Mucho, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, and a John Lennon composition called Ask Me Why. The purpose of that first session differs depending on who you ask. For example, was it an artist test? In other words, was the group any good or not? Or was it what was known as a commercial test? That would have been an evaluation of their comfort level in the studio. Were they comfortable uh, performing to microphones and with all the technology that they would need to be involved with in order to cut a record? Or was it, in fact, their first recording session? So eventually, George did agree to sign the Beatles to a contract on the Parlophone label, but not because of their musical ability, but rather because of their personalities, because of their charisma, because of their sense of humor. These 4 lads from Liverpool up north, and just their engaging way that they had about them. That's why he signed them. He felt that along with their music, would enable them to be a success. They were also very unique in other ways. For example, to one degree or another, they all sang their various songs. They were somewhat equals in this band. They weren't so and so and the somebodies like Jerry and the Pacemakers. They were all sort of equal parts in this rock and roll band made up of 4 individuals. They also did something else that was very unique. That was they performed their own material. They wrote their own songs at this point, of course, primarily John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but they wrote and then performed their own songs, which was, as I said, very, very unique. They weren't just a cover band. So their first confirmed recording session at EMI took place on September 4th of 1962. And in that session, they played Love Me Do and another song called How Do You Do It? And incidentally, they had Pete Best on drums for this first session. The song How Do You Do It was written by a man by the name of Mitch Murray. The Beatles, again, wanting to write and perform their own material, did not want to record that song. They did anyway. They never released it. But George Martin eventually acquiesced and let them off the hook, if you will. They did not record it to release it, but he did tell them that he felt that it would eventually be a #1 record. He gave it to Jerry and the Pacemakers later on, and it did in fact become a #1 hit for that group. So the next time they were back in the studio was just a few days later on September 11th. That day, they played Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, and Please Please Me, this time not with Pete Best on drums, but with a session drummer named Andy White. How in the world did that happen? Well, after the September 4th recording session, George Martin told Brian Epstein, their manager, that he just was not satisfied with the drumming of Pete Best. And so when they came back, George Martin had arranged to have the session drummer, Andy White, be there to play with the Beatles. However, the Beatles weren't aware of that. Unbeknownst to George Martin, they had actually already replaced Pete Best with a man by the name of Ringo Starr. So yes, on September 11th, there were 2 drummers sitting there to play with the Beatles. Andy White ended up playing, and Ringo was relegated to playing the tambourine on Love Me Do and the maracas on P.S. I Love You, something that it took a long time for him to get over. Well, it didn't take long for Mr. Martin to realize that this group, the Beatles, would revolutionize rock and roll music. In addition to the facets of their act that I mentioned a minute ago, he also noted how very, very curious they were. They always wanted to push the envelope, expand their horizons musically, if you will. Listen to Norwegian Wood. You'll hear the first time George Harrison plays a sitar on a Beatles track. or listen to the song Tomorrow Never Knows if you want to hear some very unusual sounds. They revolutionized techniques in music recording down to something as simple as where the microphone would be placed with the drum set that Ringo was playing. They liked using new instruments. We're all familiar with George Harrison's love of Indian music and Indian instruments later on in their career. And I'm pretty sure it's a didgeridoo that we hear on Paul's rendition of The Fool on the Hill. They had very unusual composition styles, again, as the years went on, as they began to explore more and become even more experimental. Listen to A Day in the Life or Revolution 9 if you want to hear some really crazy composition. Incidentally, John and Yoko loved the avant-garde nature of Revolution 9. They actually wanted to do a whole album of just that type of music. Well, as time went on, where George Martin as the producer had been the one driving the ship, if you will, as the Beatles became more popular and, more importantly, more profitable for EMI, those roles began to reverse. The Beatles definitely started to guide things, and they would then tell George Martin what they wanted. So those roles sort of changed over time. Well, despite this very productive working relationship, this collaboration between George Martin and the four Beatles, things did begin to deteriorate once they began work on the Let It Be project. Quick plug here for Peter Jackson's documentary, Get Back. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Do whatever you need to do to see that on Disney Plus. As a Beatles fan, it's an absolute must-see. Well, as you see in that documentary, and as you may have read elsewhere, there were just all kinds of problems during Let It Be. George Harrison actually walks out at one point. There were arguments over what songs they should do, on whether or not they would have a final performance and perform these songs, and if they did, where would that be? Just a lot of issues. And it got so bad that although we've all seen the rooftop performance that the Beatles did, the album Let It Be was not released at that time. It was actually shelved. George Harrison and John Lennon actually took those tapes to Phil Spector, an up-and-coming music producer at the time, to see if he could perhaps salvage this album. The Beatles then approached George Martin. They said they wanted to do one more album. They wanted him to produce it. It would, of course, become Abbey Road, one of their great albums. They're all great, I think. But when they approached him, he said, I want to do it, but I'm not interested in doing it unless we do it like we used to. I don't want any of this nonsense that we witnessed during the White Album and during Let It Be. So everybody kind of got back on board, and they produced that amazing Abbey Road album. That album was released on September 26th, 1969, and then Let It Be was eventually released the next year on May 8th of 1970. Well, what did George Martin do post-Beatles? He actually became a very well-known, much sought-after producer in the music recording industry. He talks about how liberated he felt, how he was now in control. He was able to do what he wanted to do and not always at the beck and call of the Beatles. And interestingly enough, he also started getting paid the way a top-flight music producer should be paid, which was not happening while he was at EMI just as an employee. If you're my age, a child of the 70s, you're familiar with some of the popular bands during the 1970s. George Martin produced a lot of those. If you're a big fan of America, like I am, he's actually the one playing the piano on that hit song, Tin Man. You may want to take a listen to that again. George Martin actually built 3 recording studios himself, 2 in London and 1 on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. Later on in his life, he collaborated with his son Giles on the production of a show called Love. It is put on in the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas. It is absolutely wonderful. Again, if you haven't seen that, I would highly recommend that you find a way to get to Las Vegas and see that show if you are a Beatles fan. A very sad episode or aspect of George Martin's life was that he actually suffered hearing loss as he got older, and he ended up devoting a lot of his time and financial resources to hearing loss research. Well, the world lost this amazing music producer on March 8th of 2016, so just a few years ago. And as I started off with, I believe that George Martin would be the first to acknowledge that he was only one cog in this machine that made the Beatles the phenomenon that they would become. And as Beatles fans, we should, of course, be very, very grateful for each and every one of them. That concludes this episode. Again, if you have enjoyed what you've heard, I would invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also refer you to my podcast, also entitled Beatle Basics, where I go into far more detail than I have on my YouTube channel. You can find that on pretty much any podcast platform. Thank you.